Chapter 801, Taming the Fifth Year, Immovable 13. Like observing a predator that you knew was coming for you specifically, Klein sent his lion forward too, with determined expression despite the fear. If he was going to lose, and he'd at least test himself against the best. The lion in its golden glory, mane flowing, looked so small compared to the nightmare of legs and chitin facing it. There was no point in waiting for opportunity. No tactic Klein could employ that would change the inevitable outcome he faced. Only option remaining was giving his best effort and hoping to last long enough to not be completely humiliated in front of everyone. The deep terror stopped charging in response. It remained motionless in position at seeing Klein's beast attacking without fear. The lion roared. Useless. Klein ordered the lion to manifest light for the blind encounter. But the deep terror was mostly blind already, feeling the vibrations in the air and ground. Phantom claws, blocked by the way's stronger legs armor. Nothing worked against this comprehensive toolkit. He could only try to bite the strongest attack of his beast. Less than 1 minute. When the lion reached 5 meters from his position, 3 of the chitinous legs shot forward with devastating speed. Velocity that Klein could barely track visually even while watching for it. The lion dodged the first strike with reflexes honed through training, twisted its body to evade the second attack. The third leg struck it barely in the flank, not with full force. Taro was clearly restraining power to avoid destroying the lion instantaneously, but sufficient impact to launch the beast 3 meters laterally through the air. The lion recovered from the strike, attempted attacking from a different angle to find opening. The deep terror counterattacked by launching a mana core as a projectile. Klein barely had time to order an evasive maneuver before the projectile exploded where the lion had been standing half a second earlier. The lion tried circling around the massive creature, searching for a blind spot in coverage. Weakness in the overwhelming defense. None existed. The deep terror had too many legs available, too many angles of attack it could deploy, too much comprehensive coverage of approach vectors. No matter from which direction Klein attempted approaching, there was always a leg ready to block or counterattack effectively. And then the deep terror decided it had played with its prey sufficiently. 4 legs launched simultaneously, from different directions, creating a net of attacks that was impossible for Klein to evade completely. And then the deep terror decided it had played with its prey sufficiently. 4 legs launched simultaneously, from different directions, creating a net of attacks that was impossible for Klein to evade completely. The lion dodged 2 of them with impressive agility, partially blocked the third. The fourth struck it directly with full force, lifting it clean off the ground, launching it 5 meters backward through the air. The lion attempted to rise after landing, and discovered it couldn't move properly. Paralyzing venom had entered its system at the moment of impact from the strike. Not lethal, not permanent, but sufficient to end the fight decisively. The lion collapsed completely, muscles refusing to respond to commands. Klein withdrew it before the deep terror could approach closer for a finishing blow. Total battle time, 43 seconds. Less than a single minute. I surrender, he announced clearly. Teacher Yang confirmed. Victory, Taro. The lion, which had defeated both Cobra and Rhinoceros with relative ease earlier, hadn't lasted even that long against a creature operating on a completely different level. Relative mercy, because Taro could have attacked with many more legs simultaneously, could have launched multiple cores at once in devastating barges. He could have ended it in less than 10 seconds instead of 43 if he'd wanted. The deep terror remained motionless at battle's conclusion, legs half deployed, ready to continue if necessary. But Taro didn't give that order too fast. Klein noticed the restraint and understood the implicit message being sent. Taro still didn't particularly like him. It wasn't a secret between them. The two had history that couldn't be erased overnight. And Taro was incredibly loyal to Run in all matters. But he was also far more grudge-holding than Rin himself had ever been. Rin forgave more easily, forgot transgressions rapidly if the person showed genuine change. It was almost frustrating sometimes for Taro how Rin let go of the past. Taro wasn't like that at all. Taro remembered every slight, held grudges close, kept them present in his mind, even when pretending they didn't matter anymore. Klein had heard later, through Mayo, who possessed fewer filters than everyone else, that Rin had specifically asked Taro not to take out too much revenge on Klein during the exam. Give him a fair fight, Rin had apparently said. But don't destroy him unnecessarily. He's already changed. He's trying to improve. And Taro, being Taro, had listened to that request, not because he necessarily agreed with the sentiment, not because his personal grudge had disappeared magically, but because Rin asked it of him, and Taro mostly did what Rin asked without question. So the elimination had been relatively gentle by comparison to what it could have been. Taro had given Klein a chance to withdraw his beast cleanly, had restrained power sufficiently so that venom was the decisive factor instead of a devastating mana blow that would have shattered the lion in an instant. It was more consideration than Klein probably deserved in Taro's mind based on his past behavior. And Klein appreciated that restraint deeply. He inclined his head slightly toward Taro while exiting the field. Taro didn't respond visibly to the gesture. His expression remained neutral and unreadable. But Klein thought he saw something loosen slightly in Taro's shoulders, as if a minor tension had been released. Perhaps with time, when Klein demonstrated consistently that the change was permanent and not temporary performance. Perhaps Taro would finally let go of the grudge completely. Or perhaps not. Either way, Klein had work ahead of him. He needed to earn respect again, not with words, but with consistent actions demonstrated over months and years. It was a long road stretching before him, but Klein was committed to walking it regardless of how long it took. One day later, Taro's battle had been yesterday. Today was different in atmosphere. Today the stands were more crowded with spectators. The energy in the air more concentrated and electric. The attention of observers more intensely focused. Because today was one of the confrontations that many had been waiting for since the exams began. Rin Patender against Larissa Dravenholm. Chapter 802, Taming the Fifth Year, Immovable, 14. There were only 8 teams left to finish the last interscholastic war exam of the year, so the audience was getting really big. Today's fight wasn't a rivalry exactly. There was no animosity between them. They didn't compete for position or recognition in a manner that implied personal conflict. But they were 2 of the strongest students in the entire 5th year. 2 who represented the best of what this generation could produce. And now they would finally face each other directly. Both had rested appropriately after their previous battles. Rin had enjoyed a complete afternoon and night to recover fully. Larissa had a similar recovery time. Their beasts were fresh and ready. Their reserves replenished to full and their minds clear and focused. It was a confrontation in optimal conditions for both participants. And everyone wanted to see who would prevail in this matchup. Zhao announced the next pairing after Taro and Leora's team had stomped their rivals once more, while Larissa listened with slight tension in her posture. Her team versus Team 5. Rin's team. Larissa felt something tighten in her stomach at the announcement. Not fear exactly. More accurately, nervous anticipation. Because she knew how this was going to end ultimately. She'd watched Rin's battles without missing any during the past years. Had observed how he'd handled Liu in the last round with ease that bordered on casual dismissal. How his Hydra had demolished its opponent without apparent effort. And Larissa was strong. Gold rank in her best beast. Excellent training and refined control over 3 elements. But she wasn't Rin Patender. Nobody was Rin Patender except Rin himself. Larissa sighed softly, the tension in her stomach increasing again slightly with each thought. Because honestly, this would probably end like Liu's match had. She would give a decent battle, show improvement from her training, but wouldn't push Rin sufficiently to make him truly exert effort. Losing easily at the end despite her best efforts. Because she had specialization in wind element primarily with decent competence in 2 other elements. Rin had absolute elemental versatility across the entire spectrum. She possessed agile beasts that were difficult to catch in combat. Rin possessed the fastest beast in the entire tournament. She had 2 powerful beasts at gold rank. Rin had 3, for actually, Rin had everything she possessed, but more of it. It wasn't a question of effort. It wasn't that Larissa hadn't trained sufficiently hard. It wasn't lack of talent or dedication on her part. It was simply the mathematical reality of their present capabilities. The odds weren't in her favor by any objective measure. But Larissa smiled slightly anyway despite those thoughts. Because even if she lost decisively, she would learn something valuable, would see something new, would understand better exactly where she stood compared to the standard that Rin represented. And at least she'd do it with dignity, with complete effort, without regrets about not having tried hard enough. So, she needed to try her absolute best, needed to give an appropriate battle so as not to disappoint him, demonstrate that the training she'd received was worth the political investment, and primarily, she needed to not reach run in an exhausted state. Because if her team was eliminated too quickly through poor matchup management without leveraging elemental advantages, and she had to face Ren with low mana reserves, with tired beasts, without fresh resources, it would be a massacre. No chance of a battle. Larissa began calculating strategies, mentally with the focus of a general. Her teammates were mid-silver rank on average. Ren's teammates were low silver. If she arranged the matchups well, if she positioned her strongest members against Ren's team in the correct order, perhaps she could force Ren to actually work before she had to enter the arena herself. And then she would have to face Ren directly, with everything she had learned, with all the power she'd cultivated, with the techniques he'd taught her turned against him. The irony wasn't lost on her. She would be fighting Ren using methods Ren himself had shared, like a student testing themselves against their teacher. Except Ren wasn't her teacher in any formal sense. He was what exactly? Friend seemed insufficient for her. Benefactor was too cold and transactional. Someone whose approval she desperately wanted to earn. Someone she wanted to prove herself worthy of. Some thing that she didn't feel brave enough to say the words for. Larissa shook her head slightly to clear those distracting thoughts. Focus. The battle was approaching. She needed her mind sharp, not wandering into complicated emotions that served no tactical purpose right now. Her teammates were gathering, looking to her for direction. Listen carefully, Larissa said with a voice projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. We're going to win this part of the deal at least. I'll arrange the order based on our elemental advantages now. She began outlining a strategy, ready to position each teammate where they'd have the best chance, knowing that even perfect positioning probably wouldn't be enough, but trying anyway, because that's what you did when facing overwhelming odds. And if you lost, when you lost, at least you lost knowing you'd done your absolute best. Larissa looked across the field to where Ren's team was preparing. Ren stood calmly, not looking particularly concerned about the upcoming battle. That confidence should have been annoying. Instead, it made her more determined to surprise him. Larissa looked toward her teammates, who looked back at her with expectation, trusting she would organize them appropriately, that she'd maximize their collective chances, deciding the order in which her members would fight, one against one in sequence. It was the strategic part of the exam that many overlooked. But Ren didn't. You needed to predict what your opponent would do, anticipating their decisions, placing your members against theirs in a manner that maximized advantages while minimizing weaknesses. Ren was good at it too, but it was scheming, social intelligence. And Larissa was exceptionally good at that particular skill. She'd lived in noble society her entire life, had grown up navigating court politics where every word mattered, where understanding what opponents were thinking was a question of survival. Ren was brilliant tactically, better combatant, better tamer in terms of pure capabilities. But in this specific aspect, Larissa held the advantage. Chapter 803, Taming the Fifth Year, Immovable 15. The two teams worked on their arrangements simultaneously, each trying to predict the other's thinking, adjusting orders based on assumptions about what the opponent would prioritize. It was a chess game before the pieces even began moving. When they finally revealed their orders to Zhao for confirmation, Larissa had won the arrangement matchup by a narrow margin, but sufficiently. She predicted correctly most of Ren's decisions about positioning, and had adjusted her own order to exploit those predicted decisions, guaranteeing early victories that would build momentum before facing him directly. It was a small advantage. Ren's team was weaker on average than Larissa's anyway. He'd had fewer quality options in the random teammate assignment lottery. But every advantage counted in this situation, especially when you knew eventually you'd have to face the monster at the end of the line. Larissa allowed herself a small smile when she saw confirmation that her prediction had been correct. Ren noticed the smile, understood what it meant, and nodded with genuine respect. Well played. Larissa inclined her head in acknowledgement. Thank you, but this only means I'll reach you with 2 or 3 victory advantages. Doesn't change the outcome. It was true, and both knew it. But Larissa would take any advantage she could secure. The initial battles began with a ceremonial announcement. First member of Larissa's team against first member of Ren's team. Victory for Larissa, as she'd anticipated. First against second. Victory for Larissa again. Faster this time. First against third. Ron entered here, demonstrating why he was one of the team's strong cards. Won cleanly against his opponent. But the score remained 2-1 in Larissa's favor. The pattern continued until Larissa obtained the final victory in the first phase, reaching Ren's turn with some more members than expected, still having advantage. But the score remained 2-1 in Larissa's favor. The pattern continued until Larissa obtained the final victory in the first phase, reaching Ren's turn with some more members than expected, still having advantage. And then it was Ren's turn to enter the field. He stood on the opposite side, observing her with a neutral expression that revealed nothing of what he was thinking. Everyone expected Ron would use the Mantis first as always. It was his most frequently deployed beast lately. The most famous now after its tournament performance. The one that had destroyed opponents with ease during the entire exam. But Ren manifested the Hydra instead. The beast appeared in an explosion of blue-green mana. The now famous 2 heads rising on serpentine necks. Diamond scales gleaming brilliantly under the afternoon sunlight. And Ren had an expression that Larissa recognized immediately. He wasn't here to just win. He was here to showcase his beast. The next member of Larissa's team, a student with Earth Beast at Silver 2 rank, prepared defensively. The Hydra didn't wait for the opponent to establish position. The first head rose smoothly, its mouth opening to reveal the glowing interior. Light concentrating in the throat with visible intensity. And then it fired almost instantaneously without prolonged charge time. A beam of pure light crossing the field in fraction of a second. The student's beast attempted blocking with an earth barrier, raising a thick wall of reinforced rock, but it didn't even reach half the necessary height for coverage on time. And the beam still struck only the upper portion with half its circumference and penetrated as if the barrier didn't exist at all. Impacted the beast directly behind the inadequate defense. Exploded in brilliance that made several spectators avert their eyes from the glare. When the light dissipated, the remaining half of the beast was dispersing into mana on the ground. The bond severed cleanly. 1 strike. Not even 5 seconds of battle total. Zhao raised his hand, barely able to process how rapidly it had concluded. Victory. Run Patender. Score now 9-6. The 7th member of Larissa's team entered with determination. Same result. The Hydra fired a light beam. 1 strike. Victory. 9-7 now. Another point in Ren's favor. 8th member advanced to the field. Light beam. 1 strike. Victory. 9-8. Same pattern repeating. The audience observed in a growing silence that felt oppressive. Because it wasn't just that Ren was winning. It was the absolute ease of it. Complete domination. Each opponent was eliminated with a single attack. Without visible effort and without significant fatigue accumulating in the Hydra. It was a demonstration of power that went beyond Taro's simple size oppression. It was a statement like establishing a standard. This is the minimum my Hydra can accomplish. This is the level where it operates. The last member of Larissa's team entered with an expression mixing determination and resignation. Knew he would lose to the same attack pattern. but had to try anyway. The Hydra fired without ceremony. Light beam. One strike. Victory. 9-9. Ren had eliminated 4 members of Larissa's team consecutively, with a single blow from his beast. With a unique attack for each one, no combination necessary, no accumulated damage strategy. The Hydra remained in position, both heads still glowing faintly with residual energy, showing no fatigue, ready to continue if necessary. And Larissa stood on her side of the field, watching the systematic dismantling of her earned advantage. She'd known it would be one-sided, but seeing it was different from knowing it. For consecutive eliminations, for one-shot victories, without the Hydra even using its second head to help in any coordinated attacks. Just the first head firing repeatedly. Like target practice, she swallowed against the tightness in her throat. This was what she'd trained so hard to face. This was the standard she'd been trying to reach. And the gap was larger than she'd hoped. But she couldn't afford dwelling on that now. Because it was her turn. She was the last member of her team remaining. The only one with a real chance of changing the outcome. The final obstacle between run and complete victory. And she had to give everything she had. Although, honestly, it wasn't going to happen. Larissa walked to her position on the field with measured steps. But that wasn't really the point. The point was to put up a proper fight, to show improvement, to prove that the training and resources invested in her were worthwhile, and mainly, to see exactly where she stood compared to the standard Ren represented. Larissa stared at the Hydra in front of her, and honestly, she had no idea how to proceed against that immovable wall. Chapter 804, Taming the Fifth Year, Light Being. The Hydra had eliminated 4 consecutive opponents without showing the slightest weakness in its overwhelming offense, without revealing any exploitable opening in its pattern, simply firing light beams that penetrated their defenses as if those barriers didn't exist at all. How did you fight against that kind of absolute dominance? How did you find any strategy against an opponent who resolved each battle with a single attack before you could even develop any appropriate response? Larissa didn't have a clear answer to those questions, but she had to choose a beast anyway for this confrontation. And so a thought occurred to her. If this is about at least resisting the light element beam, it benefits me more to deploy my light fairy first, right? It wasn't a perfect solution to the problem. It wasn't a brilliant plan that guaranteed victory or even survival. She was just using the same element to try surviving longer without really thinking about how to actually win this. But it was reasonable logic at least. If the Hydra attacked with light element, then a beast that possessed big affinity with light might have a better chance of resisting or countering those devastating attacks. Maybe, with luck. It was a thin hope to cling to, but better than nothing when facing overwhelming power. Larissa raised her hand while concentrating on the specific bond connection. Forward, she murmured, and manifested the light fairy onto the field. The creature appeared in an explosion of golden brilliance. Extremely small compared to the massive Hydra, barely a meter in height, with wings that seemed made of solid light itself. A face that was almost human, but not completely, retaining something ethereal and otherworldly. It was a beautiful beast, ethereal, the type that made spectators sigh with admiration when they saw it materialize, and with an appearance completely inadequate for the type of brutal combat that this exam now required from its participants, except that against the Hydra, against an opponent whose primary attack was an elemental light beam. Maybe, just maybe, the fairy would have an advantage that other beasts hadn't possessed. Larissa noticed Ren standing calmly across the field. Ren looked back at her and smiled slightly with something like approval. Interesting choice, Ren commented in voice that only Larissa could hear clearly. Let's see what it can do. Master Zhao raised his hand for the ceremonial gesture. Begin. And the final battle of the day started. Larissa breathed deeply to center herself. Here we go, she thought. Time to see exactly how far I've really come, and how much farther I still need to go. The Hydra's first head rose smoothly on its serpentine neck, light concentrating in its throat, glowing with intensity that made the air around it vibrate with accumulated heat, and it fired without hesitation. The beam crossed the field in a fraction of a second. The fairy didn't attempt dodging. Instead, it raised its small hands while maintaining position directly in the attack's trajectory. Several spectators inhaled sharply, anticipating its immediate destruction like the previous 4 victims. The beam impacted with full force, and the fairy absorbed most of the damage through some unforeseen mechanism. Not completely without effect, Larissa felt pain through their bond. Her beast was definitely suffering, but not the type of devastating pain that indicated critical damage. Not the kind that preceded a shattered link. It was manageable pain, tolerable, because the mineral fairy was, in certain ways, similar to the Hydra itself, or at least similar to its transparent diamond scales. The fairy was also relatively transparent. Its body wasn't exactly crystal, but shared similar properties. Structures that refracted light, instead of simply absorbing it, that could split concentrated beams into multiple components and redirect them in different directions. When the Hydra's beam impacted, the fairy's body acted like a living prism. The light entered, concentrated, and exited dispersed into dozens of lesser rays that spread in various directions like sunlight through a jewel. There was still damage from the exchange. The pure quantity of energy in the attack generated excessive heat that the fairy couldn't disperse completely. Its body glowed, almost painfully, absorbing the temperature it would have to release gradually. But it wasn't the instant destruction everyone had witnessed 4 times already. It was genuine resistance. The Hydra's second head fired immediately after without giving time for recovery. The 2-shot combo, the tactic that had eliminated any resisting opponents without much effort, descended on the fairy with force that should have ended the battle decisively. The fairy created geometric forms in front of itself. Not solid barriers, but constructions of pure light. Immaterial mirrors that reflected and refracted, that took energy from the beams and bent it at angles that reduced direct impact. The first beam struck and dispersed partially, part of the energy deflecting backward, another part finding defenses already weakened from the first strike, part penetrating more deeply through compromised protection. The reflected beam impacted half a second later. The Hydra didn't even flinch from receiving part of its own attack. The fairy, on the other hand, was launched backward 3 meters, its wings flickering with instability, its body glowing with accumulated heat it needed to release. But it remained manifested, remained conscious, remained in the battle. Larissa exhaled slowly, relieved but not relaxed. It took the combo better than expected, she thought. But it can't keep enduring that indefinitely. She needed to counterattack, needed to change the dynamic of the battle from simply surviving to actually threatening the Hydra. Searching for a solution, Rin observed the fairy recovering its position, wings spreading fully again. The body is still glowing and stabilizing, and he frowned slightly at the unforeseen resilience. He'd anticipated that the fairy would have high resistance to light. It was logical. Light beast being resistant to light attacks made sense. But the level of resistance was greater than he'd calculated, since his beams were no joke. The attacks that had eliminated previous opponents with single strikes were being partially negated through some mechanism. He needed a different approach. Chapter 805, Taming the 5th Year, Light Being 2. It crossed Rin's mind to utilize darkness immediately. The elemental weakness of light creatures was well known. A black beam of shadows would penetrate the fairy's defenses much more effectively than pure light. But Rin hesitated. Did this really justify revealing that card? Showing that the Hydra could use darkness could be a major trump card. Would demonstrate control over opposing elements that very few tamers, much less single beasts, could manifest. Rin decided to test other elements first before committing to that reveal. Fire, he ordered through their bond. The Hydra's first head opened its mouth again. But this time, instead of brilliant white light concentrating in its throat, orange-red flames began gathering with a different quality of heat. The fairy had defended well against light. Time to see how it handled a different element. Larissa saw the shift, and her eyes widened slightly. Of course, the beam, it's also not limited to light, she thought with resignation. Why would it be? The fire breath launched across the field. Not as fast as the light beam, but still difficult to track. It wasn't literal flames, but rather light infused with extreme heat characteristics. Rin thought the fairy would jump, but the fairy received the attack directly and dispersed it almost as effectively as before. The additional heat was definitely a problem. The fairy glowed more intensely than it had from pure light. Larissa felt growing discomfort through their bond as the temperature accumulated. But she was confident, since the fairy wasn't particularly flammable by nature. Its mineral body resisted combustion well through its inherent properties. The attack caused somewhat more damage than pure light had, but not sufficient to fundamentally change the outcome of this exchange. Rin thought about using the next elements in his arsenal. The fairy's attributes were earth and light. Rin knew this, which meant certain elements would be particularly effective against it, and others not so much. Earth against earth would partially cancel out through elemental neutrality. Light against light was already demonstrating itself insufficient for a decisive victory. The most useful normal element would be wood. Earth was weak to wood in the elemental cycle that governed combat advantages, but would function best from the ground. Roots and vines growing, trapping, restricting movement through physical constraint. And the fairy could fly, not because it possessed a wind element affinity, but because its wings of light generated propulsion directly through some other mechanism, could elevate itself without needing control over wind element or air currents, which made applying wood element to it effectively quite difficult. A beam from the Hydra with wood element infused. Rin considered the idea carefully. It wasn't impossible. Technically, he might imbue wood into the beam just as he'd done with fire properties, but it was way more difficult to execute properly. The mechanics of imbuing wood into a projectile that traveled at light speed were strange and contradictory. Wood was an element of slow growth, gradual development. Light was pure speed, instantaneous impact. Combining them required control that Rin hadn't practiced during his training. And the frustrating part was that nobody could help him learn this kind of specific problem faster. Hardly anyone with the ability to use both elements had life experience living through something like this or had left data. There weren't many who tried creating light attacks infused with wood element. It was too unusual a combination for common practice. Most tamers didn't even have access to both elements in a single beast. And those who possessed multiple beasts with different elements rarely had those two specific ones together. Rin was alone in this, and having to solve the mechanics in real time during an active battle. He attempted several shots, but couldn't integrate the wood mana properly, and the fairy might dodge the beams easily. Rin noticed something frustrating about the attempt. When he used wood element, the beam wasn't as fast as pure light. Imbuing elements added metaphorical weight to the attack, made it slower, gave the fairy additional fractions of a second to react. And the fairy used those fractions perfectly, dodging with grace that seemed almost choreographed. Fluid movements that carried its small body out of trajectory just in time. After the sixth failed shot, Rin realized this approach wasn't going to work. He needed real elemental advantage, but a practiced one. He needed darkness. Darkness, revelation. Rin finally made the decision. It was an important exam, after all, the final one before becoming an adult in front of his parents and friends. It was time to demonstrate a bit more of his capabilities. Yes, he'd be revealing some cards, but there was no real reason to hold this back when he had more cards and everyone would eventually learn everything anyway. Or perhaps he was just looking for excuses to show off a little more in front of the public. Who knows? Darkness, he ordered simply through their bond. The Hydra's first head responded to the command, but this time the light in its throat changed dramatically. Golden brilliance being consumed by blackness that seemed to absorb light instead of emitting it. Darkness concentrating, manifesting as a tangible presence that made the air around it feel noticeably colder. And it fired, a black beam crossing the field. Not with the speed of pure light. Darkness was also slightly slower. but fast enough that dodging normally, like it did with wood, would be impossible. The fairy began moving laterally, attempting to evade through speed. It wouldn't be sufficient. The beam would catch it, and darkness attacks were the fundamental weakness of light creatures. It would penetrate the defenses that had resisted pure light and would cause devastating damage. But then the fairy disappeared. Not invisibility, not movement too fast to track visually. Literal disappearance from existence in one location. In one place one moment. In a completely different place the next instant. The black beam passed harmlessly through empty space, continuing its trajectory until impacting the field wall in the distance. Dispersing without effect, the fairy reappeared 5 meters away. Unharmed. Spatial jump. Short-range teleportation. The same ability that Larissa used so skillfully herself. Of course, Rin thought with renewed appreciation. I thought it was strange not seeing it before, but Larissa wouldn't use such a costly ability without reason. She must have avoided using it during the heat beam because of the high mana cost. Chapter 806, Taming the Fifth Year, Light Being 3. In the stands, a murmur of surprise rippled through the audience, because now it was clear to everyone watching. The Hydra couldn't just use light element. It could also use darkness, the rarest opposing element, in the same beast and manifested with control that suggested complete mastery over both. How many elements can it use? Someone murmured in disbelief. We already saw that the mantis can use all the natural ones, another responded. Can the Hydra do the same? If it can use light and darkness, what can it do? The questions floated without answers, because nobody really knew the limits of what Rin had cultivated in his beasts. Rin fired again with a new adjusted aim for his new weapon. Darkness, targeting where the fairy had repositioned itself. Spatial jump again. The fairy disappeared before impact. Third shot. Fourth. Fifth. Each time the same result, as the fairy dodged with short teleportation that negated the speed advantage of the attack. The Hydra was having difficulty landing any successful hit despite the elemental advantage. Because it didn't matter how powerful or effective the attack was if it couldn't connect with the target. The fairy could teleport out of danger consistently. Larissa perceived confidence growing despite the overwhelming power gap. Not much confidence. She was under the illusion that she could win without counterattacking eventually. But maybe I can make him work for this. Maybe I can force him to actually exert real effort. And if she could accomplish that, if she could tire the Hydra enough that her lynx could finish the job, that would be her own victory. Small, but significant. No, she couldn't settle for just that. She decided it was time to change the dynamic of this battle. To stop only defending. To attack at her own tempo and force Rin to respond. The fairy possessed 2 elements of its own. Earth and light. The question was how to use them to obtain any advantage against the overwhelming power. Earth could form structures, could manifest solid projectiles. But the Hydra could use Earth as well and had already shown capability to disperse physical attacks before. Light was the shared base element. The fairy might not cause damage with that, but perhaps it could blind, distract, or create an opening for a more substantial attack. Larissa began formulating a rapid plan, which she quickly developed and applied in the next exchange. If she didn't have sufficient attack power to damage the Hydra directly, she would use the Hydra's own elevated power against it. The mana was depleting with so many spatial jumps, so she had to act quickly. Larissa ordered the fairy to create a curved and symmetrical structure while dodging, a structure that would direct all captured energy toward the center and deflect it back. Another beam, a powerful flash of light from the fairy to distract, and it was completed. The next shot was captured by the crystalline structure, which caught all the energy and managed to return it. It seemed the plan had worked perfectly when the crystal formation didn't shatter and functioned as intended. But Larissa lost hope when Rin smiled with his eyes closed. It was a small smile, but Larissa saw it clearly thanks to the light, and felt alarm growing in her stomach. He had something new planned. The Hydra seemed to have decided it could receive the reflected strike directly by trusting in its resistance. struck the ground with one massive limb, and a large pointed rock covered in roots broke through the formation in front of the fairy. If Rin couldn't imbue the rock's weakness into the beam properly, at least he could do it through the ground, as was commonly done. The roots didn't just break the fairy structure, they also tried to trap the small beast, forcing it to jump, teleporting laterally to evade the grasping tendrils. The fairy reappeared several meters beyond in a costly jump to escape the roots' range. And Larissa felt through their bond that it had used a significant portion of what little mana remained. The cooldown for spatial jump with so little mana wouldn't be as quick now. The ability was expensive and couldn't be used infinitely without pause. And Rena just forced that cooldown, deliberately, at the exact moment he wanted. Because when the Hydra was about to receive its own reflected darkness beam, it disappeared. The enormous beast completely vanished. Its own personal teleportation, a capability almost nobody knew it possessed. Spatial jump identical to the fairy's own, and it reappeared directly behind the fairy. 2 meters of distance. Too close to evade physically. Too close for normal dodging to function. Both heads were already manifesting energy for the attack. One illuminated with blinding light. The other darkened with pure blackness. And they fired simultaneously. 2 beams, light and darkness, launched at angles that converged on the target. They didn't fuse perfectly. The union was imperfect. You could see the separations where one element ended and another began. But they fused sufficiently well, enough to create a hybrid attack that carried properties of both and penetrated defenses against light while simultaneously exploiting weakness to darkness. An ability that, unlike the combination of light and wood, Ren had seen up close being used before by Sirius himself. The fairy attempted jumping away, but the cooldown still hadn't finished. Half a second more, and perhaps it would have been able to teleport to safety. Yet it didn't have that half second. The combined beam struck it fully, light and darkness colliding in its body simultaneously. Refraction failing because the darkness absorbed the light the fairy tried to disperse. Defense collapsing because the light penetrated easily while darkness consumed from within. The fairy shrieked, a high-pitched sound that made several spectators wince, and collapsed. It fell to the ground, impacting with a crystalline sound, wings dissolving into particles of light that dispersed in the air. Larissa felt the bond beginning to fracture, that horrible sensation of connection breaking that every tamer feared, and reached instinctively to withdraw her beast before the damage became permanent. But there wasn't enough time. The attack had been too powerful. Chapter 807, Taming the Fifth Year Dignity. The fairy was disintegrating. Larissa felt the sharp pain through the bond in the moment before it severed completely, a pain that made her inhale sharply despite her trying to maintain composure. The fairy dispersed into thousands of light particles that floated briefly in the air before disappearing completely. Beautiful and terrible simultaneously. Ren had an expression showing something that might have been regret. He spoke in a low voice that carried a genuine apology. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to go that far, but I had to ensure it fell with that strike. You were delivering me problems and might have forced me to use things I preferred keeping hidden." The lynx was her last beast. Larissa manifested it with movements that attempted to be confident, but probably showed more moral fatigue than she wanted to admit. The creature appeared in its characteristic elegant form, silver-white fur gleaming under sunlight, intelligent eyes evaluating the situation immediately. Against the Hydra that remained strong despite previous battles, the lynx would need everything it had. Larissa knew exactly what was required to give real battle to Ren's Hydra. And although the lynx had excellent control over wind, it wouldn't be sufficient, but she couldn't use ice yet like Run had suggested she would learn. Element fusion into something new was a completely different level of difficulty. The Hydra handled wind even better than the lynx despite not being specialized in it, simply because it possessed superior raw power and refined control that came from enhancements from 2 other beasts at the moment. Larissa could use the lynx's speed, its superior agility, but eventually the difference would impose itself. The battle began with the lynx moving immediately, not waiting for the Hydra to establish rhythm. It ran laterally at speed that left blurred afterimages, using wind element to propel itself faster than its physical body would naturally allow. The Hydra's first head fired a light beam that passed grazing where the lynx had been half a second earlier. The second head fired toward where the lynx was heading, anticipating its movement. The lynx changed direction abruptly, an impossible turn at a 90-degree angle that defied normal physics. The beam missed by centimeters. The third head— no, only two heads, Larissa reminded herself, but both were firing so rapidly it seemed like there were more. The lynx dodged 4 consecutive beams with a combination of speed, prediction, and wind control that deflected its trajectory at the last moment. It was an impressive display of agility that made several spectators lean forward with renewed admiration. Perhaps Larissa could make this work after all. Perhaps speed would be sufficient too. But then the pattern changed. The Hydra stopped relying solely on firing speed and raw power. Rin had observed sufficiently to understand the lynx's movement pattern, the way it used wind currents for its impossible maneuvers that defied normal physics. When the next opportunity presented itself, and the lynx attempted changing direction using an air current for propulsion, the Hydra controlled that same wind, not completely overpowering it, but sufficiently to interfere with the technique. The current that should have pushed the lynx toward the left weakened at the critical moment, reducing the force of the directional change. The lynx moved, but not as rapidly as it required for clean evasion. The light beam caught it on the flank. Not a complete direct impact, but sufficient to cause real damage that wouldn't heal quickly. The lynx howled, more in surprise than pure pain, and stumbled in its landing. Larissa felt the pain through their bond, not as devastating as what the fairy had experienced, but enough to know that another clean connection would end the battle decisively. The Hydra didn't fire again immediately to finish things. Rin kept it in position, observing the lynx recover its balance while Larissa evaluated her dwindling options. And then Larissa understood what he was doing. He was giving her an opportunity to withdraw the beast cleanly, exactly as he'd done with Lu in their match, without forcing bond rupture, without causing unnecessary pain that would linger for days. Larissa withdrew the lynx before the Hydra had to attack again. Master Zhao raised his hand with the confirmation everyone already knew. Final victory, Run Pattender's team. The silence in the stands lasted 3 full seconds. Then came the explosion of noise. Applause, shouts, conversations overlapping as everyone attempted processing what they'd just witnessed. Because it wasn't simply that Run had won decisively. It was how he'd accomplished it. Teleportation that nobody had anticipated. Combination of opposing elements. Perfect timing to exploit opponents' cooldown. It was a level of control and tactical planning that separated good fighters from master tacticians. And Run Pattender, 5th-year student, had executed it with ease that tamers with decades of experience would admire. Larissa remained motionless for a moment, processing the defeat, feeling the empty space where the bond with the fairy had been before it shattered. She felt the weight of defeat settling over her in a manner she hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just that she'd lost. She'd known that would happen before even beginning. It was that she hadn't accomplished anything substantial with the lynx, had been neutralized with a relatively simple tactic once Ren understood how it moved. And the Hydra was probably tired after all those battles. Not much perhaps, but something. Should have been an advantage Larissa could exploit. But it hadn't been sufficient. Her expression remained carefully neutral, years of noble training allowing her to maintain an appropriate poker face. But internally she felt deflated in a way she hadn't expected. She'd given her absolute best, and it hadn't been even remotely sufficient. Rin walked toward her after withdrawing the Hydra completely. He approached close enough for private conversation, his gaze studying her face in a manner that made Larissa wonder how transparent her emotions were despite the careful control of her expression. "You won." Larissa blinked, genuinely confused for a moment. "What?" "The arrangement." The initial strategy. The scheming of how to position your team against mine. Ren elaborated, his words coming faster, as if wanting to ensure she understood completely what he was saying. You won that part entirely. If it weren't for the enormous advantage I have with my main beast, if we were at the same base power level, you would have won the battle in the end with those positioning decisions. He paused, making sure she was really listening before continuing. And you gave me as good a fight as could be expected. No, better than I expected, honestly. The fairy was the perfect choice that forced me to reveal capabilities I wanted keeping hidden from the start. The Lynx could dodge those beams with pure speed. And when you completely master ice, or when you have fusion as an additional option in your arsenal like some of us have learned. He stopped, letting the implication settle. I can't imagine what you'll be capable of then. His expression softened slightly, something that might have been an encouraging smile. Don't feel this way because you lost to someone with overpowered beasts when you don't have one. You're a great tamer, Larissa. Truly. Larissa felt something in her chest loosen with those words. Tension she hadn't noticed she was holding until it commenced releasing. She smiled then, genuinely, instead of the political smile she used in social situations. She sighed softly, letting escape the rest of the disappointment she'd been carrying. It seemed that in the end she hadn't disappointed him at all. Thank you, she said simply, because sometimes simple words carried more weight than complex elaborations. Then she added with tone mixing humor and genuine determination, "You're right. And now I need you to win this entire thing." Ren looked at her with slight confusion. Why? Because if you win, then I can consider myself tied for second place. Larissa explained with logic that was perfectly clear to her. I'll have lost only to the final winner, which means technically I wasn't inferior to any of the other competitors except you. She made a vague gesture with her hand, searching for the right words, better for my pride that way. Ren laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that attracted some curious glances from nearby spectators. All right, I'll do my best then. For your pride. I appreciate the effort, Larissa responded with a dry tone, but eyes displaying real humor. They shook hands in a grip that perhaps lasted longer than Ren considered normal. Chapter 808, Taming the Fifth Year, Titans. When they separated to return to their respective areas, Larissa felt significantly better than she had moments before. The defeat still hurt, especially the broken bond with the fairy that would take time to heal completely. But Ren was right about the realities of the situation. She had done the best she could with what she had, and she'd forced Ren to work harder than he'd had to with any other opponent, except possibly Lu. And when she finally mastered the ice element, when she had fusion as an additional option in her arsenal, then future battles would be considerably more interesting. Larissa smiled to herself while walking. The path toward improvement was long, but Larissa was committed to walking it completely, one defeat at a time, if necessary. The semi-final teams. With Larissa's defeat, the bracket on Ren's side became clearly defined. His team would face the combined forces of Taro and Leora in what everyone recognized would be the most difficult battle of the exam so far for Ren. On the other side of the bracket, the situation was far less dramatic. Min and Luna's team would face a team that had considerable luck just reaching the quarterfinals at all. That team didn't have much going for it in terms of exceptional individual power or particularly brilliant strategies. What they possessed was solid consistency, most of their members being high silver rank with good training and decent positioning. They'd won their previous battles more through collective effort and some mistakes from their opponents than through absolute domination. But being here, so close to the finals among the Academy's best teams, was already an accomplishment and a stroke of fortune they could carry with pride. The day of the semifinals arrived with palpable anticipation in the air. The stands were completely filled from early morning, students and teachers alike wanting to secure good seats for what promised to be a memorable spectacle. The first battle of the day would be Luna and Min against the fortunate team, followed immediately by what everyone really wanted to witness. Ren Patender against Taro and Leora. 12:39. Swift destruction. The battle against Luna and Min's team was shorter than some had anticipated. The fortunate team fought valiantly, their members giving everything they had. But the power difference was too pronounced for effort alone to close the gap. Min entered early with his amphibian, another massive creature that had gained a terrifying reputation during the year. Everyone could see how it digested its enemies through its practically transparent body, a horrifying visual that made several spectators uncomfortable. Luna hadn't entered the field at all. It hadn't been necessary. She hadn't wasted movements or energy on unnecessary demonstrations, her new abilities remaining even more hidden than Ren's carefully guarded secrets, thanks to Min being like Taro for their team. The battle ended unsurprisingly with a decisive victory for Luna and Min's team. They would win their bracket and advance to the finals where they'd wait for the winner from the other side. Some spectators applauded the performance. Others simply nodded with recognition of what was expected. It hadn't been particularly dramatic or full of surprising twists, just clear demonstration of why these two were considered among the best of their year. But that battle was simply a prelude. Everyone knew it. The real attention, the concentrated energy of the audience, was reserved for what would come next. True pressure. Ren observed from his preparation area, while Luna's team celebrated their victory with satisfaction. He could feel the gazes directed toward him, the weight of collective expectation from hundreds, no, thousands of people waiting to see if finally someone would push him beyond his visible limits. Because this time, for the first time in the entire exam, Ren might genuinely be pressed hard enough to actually be defeated. It wasn't simply a theoretical possibility, but a genuinely plausible scenario that several observing teachers had discussed in low voices during the previous days. Taro and Leora, together, were a formidable force that exceeded the sum of their individual beasts. Both possessed 2 gold-level beasts. Both had perfected tactics considered rare and dangerous, and both knew Ren well enough to anticipate many of his characteristic strategies. They weren't opponents he could take lightly under any circumstances. And the way their team was arranged didn't help Ren at all. Taro taking the initial position as he always did, establishing himself as that immovable mountain that had destroyed everyone who attempted passing him. Sending Ren's team members before Ren himself was completely futile because none would pass Taro realistically. They were all strong for 5th-year students compared to any other year thanks to Ren's training. Yes, but they weren't anywhere near the level necessary to overcome the Golden Beetle or any of the beasts Taro could decide to manifest first. So regardless of the order, if Ren wanted to eventually face Leora, he would very likely have to pass through all 10 members of the opposing team by himself. Each one of them, one after another, accumulating fatigue, spending mana, perhaps revealing tactics against Taro that Leora would observe carefully to exploit when it was finally her turn to enter. The biggest problem, the one that made this situation particularly dangerous for Ren's team, was Leora's bash. The demonic serpent, now grown to giant size as well, moved with grace that belied its enormous mass, dodging attacks that should have connected and counterattacking with power that eliminated opponents before they could establish their rhythm. Each beast that fell left its mana available to be absorbed, feeding the bash and making it stronger as the battle progressed. If Ren was defeated at some point during this extended battle, if that beast of Leora's remained even barely alive after defeating Ren, it was highly likely the bash would devour the mana of all the beasts from his team's remaining members. Not just the beasts that had fallen last, but potentially including the ones Ren had used in battle. Chapter 809, Taming the 5th Year, Titans 2. The serpent possessed that horrible capacity to absorb energy from defeated beasts, and Taro appearing at the beginning created a stamina problem for Ren specifically against this team composition. It was a threat that converted each of Ren's decisions into calculations not just of risk, but of energy efficiency. He didn't just have to worry about winning all the individual battles using his beasts in the correct order, but about ensuring each combat was clean and efficient. Ren was virtually alone in this battle. His team knew it. He could see understanding in their faces when they gathered briefly before the matchup began. They couldn't do anything except trust in him, hoping that his capabilities would be sufficient to overcome odds that didn't particularly favor them. Ron approached first, his expression serious but determined. "Just tell me what you need me to do." Rin looked at his teammate. Ron had won matches, had shown real improvement from the training methods Ron had shared. But against Taro's Golden Beetle, there was no realistic chance. Still, Rin considered Ron's question for a moment, evaluating options rapidly in his mind. Things could proceed relatively normally and predictably if he simply accepted the reality of the situation as it stood. Taro would enter first as he always did, establishing his position as the immovable wall. Rin could send his team to wear down Taro even minimally before entering himself. But if Leora entered first with the bash, the more he thought about that scenario, the less he liked the idea. His teammates would be sacrificed without accomplishing anything significant beyond feeding the serpent's growth. Except being lucky, so Taro goes first might at least force the terror or the beetle to spend some energy. But too risky. "Come here, gather closer," Rin said to his team. When Master Zhao announced the beginning and requested that the first combatant from each side step forward, Taro emerged with the confidence of someone who'd done this dozens of times without losing a single match. From the other side, Ron walked onto the field with an expression showing quiet resolve. Taro sighed softly when he saw that Ron was first instead of Ren. He'd hoped to surprise Ron in a specific way he'd planned carefully. Throughout the entire exam, Taro had been using the Deep Terror as his first entry beast, establishing a pattern that anyone observing would eventually notice. The idea was that Run would choose his beast considering the Terror as the most probable opponent, optimizing his selection to deal with the multiple articulated legs and unsettling versatility of that creature, perhaps sending the Mantis or Wolverine first. And then Taro would have deployed the Golden Beetle instead, completely surprising Ren and forcing him to adjust his strategy in the middle of battle when he'd already committed to a beast choice. It was a simple tactic, but potentially very effective against an opponent who depended so much on careful preparation to conserve energy through the 10 consecutive battles awaiting him. But now with Ron entering first, the surprise would no longer be surprising for Ron. Taro would have to reveal the beetle now, or maintain the terror pattern and lose the opportunity to use that tactic completely. Run had taken precautions. Earlier, team discussion. "Enter first before me," Run decided finally after his group had gathered. Ron blinked, clearly not expecting that instruction. "Me? I thought you wouldn't want." "I know." Ren interrupted with a tone that left no space for debate. "But if Leora enters, she'll only absorb your fire beast mana. And if Taro enters, I need information about which beast he'll deploy first. And I need you to get that information for me." Ron understood immediately what Ren was asking. It wasn't fighting to win, it was fighting to learn. To force Taro to reveal his first card before Ron had to commit to his own choice. It was a calculated sacrifice that Ron accepted without further questioning. The other team members listened in silence, understanding the logic even if it meant Ron would be a sacrificial piece. "Make him work for it," Ren added. "Don't just roll over. But your primary objective is reconnaissance, not victory." Ron nodded. "I understand." The rest of the team exchanged glances, recognizing the cold efficiency of the strategy. This was what tactical thinking looked like. Pieces sacrificed not out of cruelty, but out of necessity for the larger victory. Back to present. Taro decided there was no point saving the beetle longer if the surprise was already ruined. The golden beetle materialized on the field with a presence that made the ground vibrate slightly under its massive weight. The creature was a living testament to what proper cultivation and adequate resources could achieve with a beast most had considered mediocre at best. Now, it was an absolute monster that had earned the nickname the Immovable Mountain with every demolishing battle it had fought. Ron manifested his salamander with determination everyone recognized as admirable bravery in the face of impossible odds. The fire beast glowed with flames covering its body, ready to give everything it had, even knowing it wouldn't be sufficient. The combat lasted less than 2 minutes. Ron attempted using speed and fire attacks to find an opening in the beetle's defenses, but each attempt was blocked by the sand and living minerals defense with ease bordering on insult. The Salamander's flames that luckily managed to pass the defense just splashed against the golden carapace like water against stone, creating some momentary heat but no damage. The beetle moved with speed a creature of its size shouldn't be able to manifest, closing distance when Ron tried maintaining it to press his non-existent elemental advantage. Every time the salamander created space, the beetle crossed it in seconds. Ron tried different angles of approach, tried focusing fire on joints between armor plates, tried overwhelming concentrated points with sustained flame. Nothing worked. The beetle's defense was simply too complete, too refined through years of cultivation under Ren's methods. The end came when the beetle simply charged directly through the fire barrier the salamander had established as desperate defense on the last free edge of the field. The flames licked the golden carapace without causing visible damage, and then the beetle was upon the salamander, crushing it against the ground with a weight no Silver 2 beast could resist. Ron withdrew his salamander before it could be dispersed entirely, accepting defeat with grace that earned respectful nods from spectators. He hadn't accomplished anything significant in terms of damaging the beetle or wearing it down noticeably, but he had accomplished something crucial for his team. He confirmed exactly what Ren would face first, had forced Taro to reveal his strongest hand from the beginning, had contributed to the greater good by providing critical information Ren needed to make informed decisions. It was a sacrifice that wouldn't appear in official battle records as a significant contribution, but those who understood real strategy would recognize it as valuable service to his team. Ron walked off the field with head held high despite the swift defeat. He'd done his job. Now, it was Ren's turn to do his. Chapter 8-10, Taming the Fifth Year, Titans 3. Ren walked onto the field smiling. It wasn't an arrogant or condescending smile, but a genuine expression of anticipation. Because finally, after all the battles he'd fought during this exam, he would face a challenge requiring his complete effort, very probably all three of his combat beasts. Taro observed him approaching with an expression mixing determination and something that might have been contained excitement. These two had trained together for years, had fought side by side, had developed mutual understanding that came from years sharing living space and pushing each other to improve constantly. And now they could measure their strength against each other once more. Ren considered his options quickly in those final seconds before committing. The mantis would be a bad choice against the beetle. That was obvious to anyone with basic understanding of how defense and offense functioned. The mantis depended on speed and precision, could eradicate all 8 lesser team members easily to save the energy of the other 2 beasts, but the beetle possessed defense the mantis couldn't penetrate easily. It would be a war of attrition that wouldn't favor Ren at all. The Wolverine was his most versatile option, so Ren went directly to the Hydra again, manifesting it in an explosion of blue-green mana that echoed the massive presence of the beetle. 2 enormous beasts, the most advanced in the entire school in terms of raw power and refined cultivation. The beetle had been the first gold-ranked beast in Ren's close circle, a new record for the youngest gold-ranked tamer, that monumental achievement that had opened doors for others to follow the right path. And the Hydra was the second, if you didn't count the light and mana mushroom that nobody except perhaps Ren himself and the mushroom considered a battle beast. Both creatures observed each other with what could be described as instinctive recognition between apex predators. The Hydra with its 2 heads raised, diamond scales gleaming under the sunlight. The beetle with its golden carapace reflecting that same light, legs planted firmly in position communicating absolute stability. The air between them seemed to thicken with concentrated mana as both beasts prepared themselves. The audience fell silent, recognizing they were about to witness something special, not just a battle, but a clash between 2 philosophical approaches to power made manifest in physical form. The beetle represented perfect defense, immovability, the idea that if you couldn't be moved, couldn't be hurt, you would eventually wear down any opponent through sheer endurance. The Hydra represented the perfect balance between defense and attack, stability, The idea that if you possessed both attack and defense, you'd have more ways to deal with your opponent. Doubled power, meeting an immovable object. One of them would have to give. Taro's demeanor was serious now, all traces of the earlier amusement gone. This wasn't like facing Ron's salamander or any of the other opponents who'd fallen before the beetle. This was Rin Patender with what could be his most powerful beast. This would require everything Taro had learned, every technique he'd perfected, every ounce of tactical thinking he'd developed. And he welcomed it. Because what was the point of becoming strong if you never tested yourself against someone who could push you to your limits? Rin's smile faded as well, replaced by focused intensity that made several spectators lean forward unconsciously. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for. Master Zhao raised his hand, almost hesitant to interrupt the moment of accumulated tension between two of the Academy's finest. Begin. The Hydra's first head rose immediately, wasting no more time on posturing or intimidation. Light concentrated in its throat with the usual speed, brilliance increasing to the point where several spectators had to squint against the glare. The light beam fired with force that made the air vibrate visibly. It crossed the distance between the two beasts in a fraction of a second, the perfect trajectory aimed at the beetle's center mass. Yet the beetle responded with speed that defied its massive size. It didn't attempt dodging. That would have been admitting the attack was a threat requiring evasion. Instead, it expelled the defense of sand and minerals from its abdomen. Sand exploded around the beetle. Not a simple dune, but a solid construction of multiple layers of compacted sand and mineral that pushed outward from a beast. The light beam struck the flowing mineral and sand with an intense sound. The energy penetrated, piercing through the first layer, then the second, excavating a path by melting through a defense that would have stopped most attacks completely. But it didn't breach all the way through, didn't even reach the beetle itself. The defensive layers kept regenerating and absorbed what remained of the beam's energy, dispersing it into heat and mineral fragments that rained harmlessly around. The beetle remained unharmed behind its hold, but not overcome layers of defense. It had received no damage. Rin smiled, seeing his first shot had been completely stopped by the beetle's defenses. It wasn't frustration he felt, but something closer to pure satisfaction at seeing his advice and knowledge working so effectively for his friends as well. Both heads, he ordered through the bond with the Hydra. Both heads rose simultaneously, light concentrating in both throats. The brilliance intensified rapidly to the point of creating harsh shadows on the field despite the bright sun above them. And then they fire at the same time, two beams converging toward the same point in the beetle's cracked defenses. Taro responded immediately, not allowing his beast to be caught by surprise by the power increase. The beetle generated more defense in front of itself, layers multiplying from its frontal section at speed that spoke of their extensive practice. Compacted sand mixing with the yellow living mineral that seemed to ignore physics laws, creating overlapping structures that reinforced each other mutually. One layer, two, three, 5 layers appearing in less than 5 seconds. The twin beams impacted with double the force from the first attack. The energy excavated through the defenses with implacable resolve, destroying layer after layer while penetrating deeper. The sound was deafening now, a continuous beam that made the ground vibrate under everyone's feet on the field. But even with double the power, it wasn't sufficient.